Well, turn with me this morning to the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 22. As we continue our study through the first book of the Bible. Of course, this past week, the attention of the world was focused on the monumental effort to rescue the Titan submersible that carried 5 men to the wreck site of the Titanic. I'm sure everyone followed that story this week. I got my haircut this week, and it was the talk of the barbershop. The submersible, of course, as most of us now know, was built and operated by OceanGate, a company that offered tourists a rare opportunity to dive down into the North Atlantic, 2 miles down, to see the wreck of the Titanic, of course, which sank back in 1912 after hitting an iceberg. And so last Sunday, in fact, it was about an hour before our service started, 5 men boarded that submersible and began the 2-hour descent to the wreck site. And then we learned that afternoon that an hour and 45 minutes after the dive began, all communication with the submersible was lost. And then, of course, you probably saw, as I did over the following week, news stories began to creep out. Things showed up on the internet. Interviews with the owner or the CEO of the company. His name was Stockton Rush. Some of those were quite disturbing. In those interviews, Rush seemed to have a flippant attitude about safety and an overconfidence in the reliability of his submersible. At one point, he bragged in an interview about the cheap parts he had used on the sub, such as a modified PlayStation game controller for navigation. At one point, he told a reporter, at some point, safety is just pure waste. And then later, in another interview, I saw him tell a reporter, this submersible is unsinkable, to which the reporter replied, isn't that what they said about the Titanic? Of course, sadly, all 5 men perished when the submersible failed and imploded at the bottom of the ocean. These 5 men had put their trust in a vessel that they believed would take them on the voyage of a lifetime and bring them back safely. But tragically, their trust was misplaced. Misplaced trust. If I was to describe the point of tension that stands at the center of the storyline of the Bible, I think that would be it. Misplaced trust. There's always, in every story, there's a point of tension. And that point of tension, I think, in the Bible can be summed up in those 2 words, misplaced trust. And in the Garden of Eden, you remember Adam and Eve were given a simple command. You may eat freely of every tree in the garden, but of that tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat, lest you die. And as we've said, there's nothing mystical about that tree, nothing magical about that tree. That tree was simply a test, a test of trust. Will you trust me, the one who made you, the one who loves you, the one who has your best interest at heart? Or will you trust yourself, believing that your way is better, believing that somehow you can improve on what I have made, my plan? C.S. Lewis said, it's either my will be done, or thy will be done. Which will it be? And that's what the tree symbolized. And of course, tragically, the man and the woman chose to trust themselves instead of God. And their misplaced trust, the Bible calls that misplaced trust sin, led to the loss of God's blessing and produced catastrophic consequences, leading to brokenness, suffering, and then, of course, ultimately death, as God had promised. But immediately following the entrance of sin into the world, God made a promise to rescue and redeem the image bearers He had made, restoring to His creation the blessing that had been lost. That was the point. I'm going to restore the blessing that was forfeited in the garden. But of course, soon it became clear, and Genesis 1 through 11 testifies to this time and time again. It became clear that man would not cooperate with God, though God was patient with them, giving them every opportunity to turn to Him, every opportunity to trust Him, and yet continually they failed to do so. They refused to trust His promises and instead trusted themselves. There were exceptions, of course. There was Seth, and there was Enoch, and there was Noah. Men who trusted God and obeyed Him, but they were the exceptions to the rule in their generation, and sadly the impact of their faithfulness was somewhat limited and temporary. But then in chapter 12 of Genesis, just as it seemed all hope was lost, God turned His attention to one man, a man by the name of Abraham, choosing him, you remember, from among all the peoples of the earth. And He promised to do something unprecedented with this man. Through Abraham, God was going to save the world and restore the blessing that was lost in Eden. He promised to bless him, to make his name great. He promised that from him a great nation would come, and they would settle in a land of their own. And through them, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Abraham was God's chosen vessel to restore blessing to this fallen world. And as such, God was going to work on Abraham to make him the exemplar of faith, demonstrating to all who would come after him what it means to trust God unreservedly. That's what Abraham's role in the story of redemption is. His role is unique among all the figures of the history of redemption. Abraham is the exemplar of faith. God would reveal Himself to Abraham in a way that He had not done before. No one since Adam had known God the way that Abraham would know God. And so Abraham obeyed the call of God. You remember, he left his home and he left the false gods of Mesopotamia, the false gods of his father, in order to follow Yahweh, the one who had revealed Himself, to follow Yahweh. And of course, you remember, the moment Abraham stepped out in faith, the testing began. The moment Abraham stepped out in faith, his faith began to be tested. Upon arriving in Canaan, you remember, Abraham finds famine in the land, and that's his first test, the test of provision. Will God provide for me? And of course, Abraham failed that test. He fled the land of Canaan, and he goes into Egypt, and while there in Egypt, he faces another test, the test of protection. Sarah, tell these men you are my sister, because if you don't, they might kill me and take you from me. And again, Abraham failed the test. Sarah is my sister, he said, and Pharaoh, of course, took her as his wife. And he enriched Abraham. It went well. Remember, Abraham, do this, Sarah, so it will go well with me. And it did go well with him in the sense that he was given great riches by the hand of Pharaoh in return for Sarah. But Abraham knew it was not well. This was not God's plan. And so God intervened, you remember. He miraculously intervened. He sent plagues upon the house of Pharaoh. And so much so that Pharaoh quickly returned Sarah to Abraham and begs them, please leave Egypt. Take everything I gave you, take it and leave. In spite of Abraham's lack of faith in God's provision, in spite of his lack of faith in God's protection, God still graciously protected and provided for him, going above and beyond all that Abraham could have imagined. And in that lesson was, you can't screw this up, Abraham. Your unfaithfulness cannot overcome my faithfulness and the promise I have made. And so you remember Abraham and Sarah departed Egypt, and now they're very rich in herds and very rich in flocks and servants and so on. And Abraham was quite a wealthy man at this point. And this in turn led to another test, the test we said of prosperity, when he and Lot found themselves in the same pasture lands and found that their herds and flocks were too great for this small area of pasture land. So what would Abraham do with this test of prosperity? Would he act harshly toward Lot in order to protect his own financial interest? Or would he entrust himself to God? And of course, we know Abraham chose the latter, entrusting himself to God and offering Lot the pick of the land. And Lot, of course, in turn responded by choosing the best land for himself. And so Abraham, it would seem, got the short end of the stick. But you remember, Lot chose Sodom. Abraham chose Canaan. Though what that land lacked in fertility, it made up for in promise. And after that, you remember God appeared to Abraham in a vision, and he restated that promise that he had made in Ur. And you remember Abram's response, how's this, God, you've not given me a son. How can you tell me I'm going to be a great nation and that my descendants will be like the sand of the seashore and the stars of the heaven when I don't even have a son? All I have is a servant. My heir is my servant. So God reassures Abraham, and you remember he made a covenant with him, declaring that he himself will fulfill this promise to Abraham and his descendants. In fact, he cut the covenant between the animals, you remember, as a sign, as a testament to the fact that if this promise is not fulfilled, I myself will be cut off from the land of the living. I myself will be accursed. Following the establishment of that covenant, you remember Abraham immediately was once again faced with a test of provision. There's the promise, then faith, then a test. This time the test of provision would come from his wife, the closest person to him on the earth, who, believing that if the promise is going to be fulfilled, it could not be fulfilled through my broken down body. I'm an old lady. So here, Abraham, take my servant Hagar and go into her and have a child. Have the child of promise through her. Everything will work out perfectly. And so Hagar, you remember, the servant bore a son to Abraham. His name was Ishmael. But as the story goes, you remember the arrival of this son did not produce the promised blessing. In fact, it created great conflict and heartache for everyone involved, teaching Abraham a vital lesson. The works of man cannot produce the righteousness of God. Soon after Ishmael's birth, God spoke to Abraham again, ordering him, you remember, to be circumcised along with all the males of his household. That this circumcision was to be a sign of the covenant. And it follows that story of Abraham and Hagar and Sarah. And the circumcision, this act of cutting away of the flesh of the foreskin, was to be a lesson to Abraham and to all who would come after him, that if the promise is to be realized, it cannot be realized by way of the flesh. The flesh must be cast away. The promise must be realized by faith. And that testimony would be something that would carry down through the ages of the Jewish people, as each male on the 8th day was circumcised, as a reminder that if the promise was to be fulfilled through the procreative act that the Messiah would come through, it would not come by the flesh, it would come by trust in the promise of God. After this, of course, the Lord appeared to Abraham and Sarah. The first time we know in recorded history there that he had appeared to her, not just to him. And you remember, he comes to the tent. The Lord and the two visitors come to the tent, and he says, about this time next year, I will come back, and Sarah is going to have a child. Remember, Sarah, I think, was probably back there kneading some bread or something, and she laughed. Of course, God called her out on her laughter, a laughter born out of a lack of faith. And of course, who wouldn't laugh, right? If you found yourself as a 90-year-old woman being told by God that you're going to bear a child, I mean, that sounds like something from a comedy skit. But you remember, before the Lord departed Abraham and Sarah there in the tent that day, he revealed his intention to Abraham to destroy the city of Sodom because of its corruption and its wickedness. And you remember what Abraham did? He responded. He said, well, what will you do about the righteous? Will you destroy them along with the wicked? Abraham was trying to feel out God's sense of justice. Help me understand, God. What does it mean that you are just if you're going to kill the wicked or the righteous along with the wicked? And so you remember that back and forth between Abraham and God, where he humbly asks God, will you spare the city if there are 35? How about 30? How about 20? And it goes down to 10 people, and God affirms his justice and that he would not destroy the righteous with the wicked. And it is through Abraham's intercession, you remember, and the deliverance of Lot from Sodom, that Abraham learned that God is always just. God has the right to destroy the wicked, but he is always just, and he will always save the righteous. And then, of course, just as the Lord had promised a year earlier, Abraham and Sarah miraculously conceive and bear a son in their old age, a son whose name was Isaac, ironically, whose name means laughter. The son of promise had finally arrived. After 25 years, the son of promise was here. However, even in the midst of Abraham's rejoicing, he would find himself facing yet another test. When the Lord appeared to him, instructing him to send his son Ishmael away, entrusting him to the Lord who had promised to care for him and bless him. You see, there could be only one son of the promise, and Isaac was that son. Ishmael and Isaac stand as two figures in redemptive history. Isaac represents the son of the promise by faith. Ishmael represents the attempt to fulfill the promise by the flesh. And of course, as Paul said in Galatians, these two represent something. They represent works versus faith, and so they cannot coexist together. In order to take hold of faith, you must let go of works. In order to take hold of works, you must let go of faith. So it has to be one or the other. And so Abraham obeys, and he sends Ishmael and his mother away. And of course, as God had promised, the Lord cared for him. But the lesson was there, and it was clear. And so now it would seem that the promise has come full circle. Following the peace treaty, you remember, with Abimelech at the close of chapter 21, which we looked at last week, we read these words, and Abraham, at the end of chapter 21, and Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. It would seem that Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, the family of promise, can now live happily ever after. But of course, this was not to be the case. God still had one more test for Abraham, a test that would secure his position once for all as the father of the faith, the exemplar of faith for all those after him who would trust in God. You see, each generation of Abraham's descendants would find the promise under threat, and each time they would hear the words, when that moment of threat came, they would hear these words, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And those words were to serve as motivation for them in that moment to trust God and obey him, even in the midst of great difficulty, even when obedience didn't make sense, even when that act of obedience itself appeared to threaten the promise, as is the case in our text this morning in Genesis chapter 22. I encourage you this morning to follow along with me as I read, beginning in verse 1 of Genesis 22. This is the word of the Lord. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, My father. And he said, Here, my son. He said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things it was told to Abraham, "Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed and Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. This is the word of the Lord. Our focus this morning is going to be primarily on verses 1 through 19. That last section there, verses 20 to 24, are kind of an excursus preparing us for what is to come in a couple of weeks when Isaac is seeking a wife. We're getting a little foreshadowing of this one named Rebekah who was born, and we'll learn more about that in the coming weeks. But we're going to focus primarily this morning on the first 19 verses here of the chapter. You remember again, at the end of chapter 21, we find Abraham and Sarah have settled there in Beersheba, in the land of promise. They've settled there with Isaac, who is the son of the promise. And it seems like everything's great. They're in the land, right? Beersheba, they're in the promised land. And here they are with the son of promise. They'd waited nearly 30 years for their faith to be sight. And here it is. Here he is. You can imagine Abraham's joy in that moment, can't you? But you can also imagine the awesome weight of responsibility he must have felt. Pastor and author Glenn Scrivener imagines the scene. I thought this was interesting, kind of funny. He says, "Picture baby Isaac lying in Abraham's arms. What do you have? You have the hope of the world. No Isaac, no Israel. No Israel, no Christ. No Christ, no salvation. So whatever you do, Abraham, don't drop him." I mean, think about it. If ever there was a justification for helicopter parenting, I would think this would probably be it. Protect him at all costs. And I'm sure that was part of Abraham's desire. I mean, this is the precious promise of God. Nothing can happen to him. But just as these thoughts were going through Abraham's mind, just as it seems Abraham's story is winding down like a man in retirement who can look back at his family with joy and just relax, just in that moment, these words come. Verse 1, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." What we read here is so shocking and so difficult to the reader, so difficult for the reader to wrap their mind around, that we're told right at the start, this is a test. This is a test. It's kind of like that, you know, when you get that emergency broadcast system thing that comes on, right? You're sitting around the house, or maybe you're driving in a car, and all of a sudden you're and right away you just kind of stop because you're waiting for the words, what? This is a test. If you don't hear those words, it's time to seek shelter, right? That's the idea. And so we're told right out of the gate, this is a test. Now that's good for us, right? Not so good for Abraham because he wasn't let in on this. Now, I suspect he might have assumed this could be the case. I mean, after all, as we just saw, he had been through test after test after test after test after test. So we know right at the start that everything is going to be okay, but Abraham doesn't. So you can just imagine what must have been going through his mind when he heard those words. And of course, we're told nothing here ultimately of Abraham's feelings, but the text does provide us with a few clues. Notice first the way that God describes Isaac there in verse 2. He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love." We're given a window here into Abraham's heart. And we see that Isaac occupied a place in Abraham's heart, a place of love. He treasured this boy. He was the only son of the promise. There was not another. Ishmael had been removed from the scene because he could not be the backup. He could not be the one because the works of men cannot produce the promise. So he could not be the son of promise. This is it. Isaac is the only one. Abraham's heart must have been filled with turmoil. I mean, the heart-wrenching nature of what is happening here is evident in the story. In fact, linguistically, Abraham's actions are described in what amounts to linguistic slow motion. The language here, every step of what Abraham does is said. I mean, this story could have been much shorter. But everything that Abraham does is revealed. The saddling of the donkey, something Abraham, a wealthy old man, probably hardly ever did. His servants would have done that. But Abraham saddles his donkey. Then this old man, who has all of these servants, cuts the wood himself. And you can imagine, it's almost like prolonging this thing. And so I don't envision this as like immediate obedience without turmoil. I imagine that there's a little of both. The desire to obey, but also great turmoil. But everything, the saddling of the donkey, the cutting of the wood, the placing of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, the placing him on the altar, laying down the wood, and even the description of the hand going up with the knife, all of that is there. It's like linguistic slow motion to make you enter into the story and feel what Abraham was feeling. The turmoil of his soul. The agony of faith. Yet in spite of this turmoil, Abraham never once questions God. Never once does he try to reason with him. Never once does he try to ask God to reconsider, as he had done in Genesis 18 and 19, right? Something has changed in Abraham. Something has happened. He does not question God at all. He simply obeys. And he obeys over the course of 3 days. This wasn't like, Abraham, do this, go out in the backyard and make sure it's done by 10 a.m. No, 3 days he had to journey. Can you imagine what that journey must have been like as he walked with his beloved son to this place where he was to sacrifice him? The first glimpse we find that into Abraham's mind is verse 5. Notice there, after he arrives at the mountain, he tells his servants to stay here with the donkey, he says. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. There's a hint there, right? That Abraham evidently believes that Isaac is coming back. He doesn't know how, but when he comes back, Isaac will be with him. So we see a glimpse of Abraham's heart and mind, and it's a heart and mind of faith. Isaac will come again with me. And then we find the basis for this faith in verses 7 and 8. Notice, as they're walking up the mountain to the place of sacrifice, you have this really heart-wrenching conversation. You can almost picture it. Isaac said to his father Abraham. Now remember, he's walking with his beloved son, and suddenly Isaac says, "My father, Dad, here I am, my son." And he says, "Behold, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" So Isaac is not aware of what God has commanded. Abraham has been carrying this. We don't get any indication that he's spoken to Sarah or the servants or anyone else. He alone is bearing this weight. And he hasn't even told Isaac. And so Isaac is looking around, and he's old enough, obviously, to understand that something is amiss. If we're going to have a burnt offering, there must be a lamb. Notice what Abraham says in verse 8. God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. The ethical conflict of what he has been told to do is not lost on Abraham, okay? He's not lost. Sacrificing Isaac was out of line with everything that God had revealed to him thus far. This made no more sense to Abraham than it makes to us. At Sodom, you remember, God had showed himself just in not destroying the righteous along with the wicked. In Egypt and Gerar, God had miraculously intervened to save his life in order to preserve the promise. So why would God jeopardize the promise now? That seems to be Abraham's reasoning. I don't get this. This makes no sense, but I trust him. And so they ascend Mount Moriah. We read in verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. There's that linguistic slow motion again, right? Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. This was not something Abraham was eager to do. Everything in him was crying out, don't do this. And yet he obeyed. Then just before Abraham plunges the knife into his son, verse 11, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Imagine how quickly Abraham dropped that knife. Abraham passed the test. Dr. James Smith writes, God did not desire the death of Isaac, but the heart of his father. In passing the test, Abraham demonstrated once and for all that his hope did not rest in himself, but in God alone. That his treasure was not the things that God gave him. His treasure was God. And then in verse 13, we see Abraham's faith become sight. This is a beautiful picture. Notice, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And of course, verses 15 and following, we find again another restatement of the promise. And the angel of the Lord appeared from heaven, called from heaven a second time, and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba. So once again, Abraham's faith is realized. His faith is realized. Though he did not understand, though he could not see how God would fulfill the promise, he believed that he would come through just as he had done in the past. Abraham had learned the lesson well. He was confident that his trust in God was not misplaced. He believed that the Lord would provide. How, he didn't know. Maybe it would mean bringing Isaac back from the dead. In fact, the writer of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 that it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. You see, though Abraham could not foresee God's method of provision, he obeyed nonetheless because he had experienced his record of provision. Think about that for a moment. Abraham could not foresee how God would provide, but he knew from his record of God's faithfulness that God would provide. So many times we look ahead and worry, right? When we should look back and trust. All of the promises of God, all of the track record of God, his faithfulness to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the saints of old are there as a testament to us that this same God is the God who will meet your needs. This same God is the God who will provide for you. As Charles Spurgeon so eloquently put it, God is too hard or too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. When you cannot trace his hand, you must trust his heart. When you cannot trace his hand, you must trust his heart. You see, God had promised Abraham that through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Without Isaac, there would be no hope, no blessing for the families of the earth. But because Abraham knew God, he trusted that God would provide what was necessary for the fulfillment of the promise. Abraham could walk up that mountain with his son and say the words, "It is well with my soul." Not because of the absence of turmoil and anxiety, but because of the character of God. I heard Greg Laurie, some of you know Greg Laurie, an evangelist. Some years ago, his 20-something or 30-something-year-old son who had a wife and children was killed tragically in a car accident right outside of the church where he served. Very tragic situation. And I saw an interview with Greg Laurie where he recounted something that Pastor Chuck Smith, who was the founder of Calvary Chapel, said to him in that moment when Laurie was grieving and trying to figure out what in the world was happening and why God would allow this. And listen to what Chuck Smith said. I always thought this was so profound. He said, "Never trade what you don't know for what you do know. I don't know and I don't understand, but I do know this." And that's what God is calling Abraham to do here. Don't trade what you do know for what you don't know. Abraham was faithful. And because he didn't trade what he knew for what he didn't know, in time, God made the unknown to him. God revealed it. He lifted up his eyes, and there in the thicket was a ram. I mean, incredible. Oh, how Abraham must have rejoiced when he saw that ram. It's interesting to note that the substitute that God provided, however, when Abraham was off slightly in what he believed. He said God would provide a lamb, but it wasn't a lamb that God provided, it was a ram. You see, the provision of the lamb was still future. I want you to notice how the story here on Moriah ends. Look at verse 14. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." I want you to notice the future tense. The Lord will provide. Even long after Abraham had died, you remember the book of Genesis was given to the Israelites after the Exodus from Egypt. So this is many years, hundreds and hundreds of years later, after Abraham's time. And even at that time, it says, to this day, he says, during this day, the Exodus time, on the mount of the Lord, it will be provided. So it's still future tense. So what does all this mean? Well, the name of the mountain actually is a hint for us. If in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, we read these words, which is one of the places Mount Moriah is mentioned. And listen, it's a record of the construction of the tabernacle or the temple by King Solomon, David's son. Listen to what it says, 2 Chronicles 3:1. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father. Mount Moriah is the Temple Mount. It is the mount of sacrifice. The altar where Isaac was laid, the altar upon which the ram was offered, stood on the very mountain where another altar would one day stand. The altar in the temple, the place, you remember, where countless lambs would be sacrificed, each one foreshadowing the Lord's provision. Every sacrifice that was offered was a testament that the Lord will provide. For hundreds of years, following the example of their father Abraham, the Jews would offer lambs upon the altar in the temple of Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, just as Abraham had done. And each lamb offered there was the worshiper's declaration of faith that the Lord will provide. That one day, the promise of salvation and blessing would come on this mountain, here, in this place. And friends, that day came. That day came when another promised son came to Mount Moriah. And there, like Isaac, he was bound. And like Isaac, the wood was placed upon his back. And he was laid upon an altar. a cross. And there, in that moment, his father raised his hand against his only son. Only this time there was no one to stay that hand. The prophet Isaiah described what happened there this way. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. Why? When his soul makes an offering for guilt. Because he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. By his wounds, we are healed. That son of the promise was Jesus. He is the Lamb of God whom the Lord has provided. The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He died on the cross for your sin and mine, taking the punishment that was due us for our sin, for our failure to trust him. And 3 days later, what Abraham believed God would do for Isaac, he did for Jesus. He raised him from the dead. And now the Lord has made another promise, the promise that if you, here this morning, listening to these words, that if you will believe, if you will follow in the footsteps of Abraham, and you will trust in God's provision of salvation and blessing through Jesus Christ, you will be forgiven of your sin and given new life, given eternal life. We have a huge advantage over Abraham. Abraham couldn't see the method of provision, but it has been revealed to us. That is why Jesus said, Abraham longed to see my day, and when he saw it, he was glad. Friends, the testing of Abraham is recorded here for us as a lesson. And it's not a metaphorical lesson about everyday tests and trials of life, as so many expositors kind of make the point of this particular text of Scripture. We can learn about testing and trials from this passage, but this is not talking about the test of, your kids spilling milk at the breakfast table or not getting a parking spot at the mall. No, there's something much greater. The lesson here is much greater, and the lesson stands at the very heart of God's plans and purposes for the world. This lesson stands at the very heart of God's plans and purposes for you. And the lesson is this: that the promise of God to save and bless the world, to save and bless you, will not ever be realized through the schemes and workings of men. It will only be realized by trusting fully in the God who made the promise. Abraham learned from experience that God is trustworthy. Even when it didn't make sense to him, even when trusting meant that the son of the promise must die by the hand of the Father, he obeyed. Paul said that the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. It made no sense to Abraham what he was being asked to do. It was foolishness to him. But he obeyed. The cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, to the world. It simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. But we're told, Paul says, that God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. To make it abundantly clear that no one is going to create utopia on this earth and bring salvation in by their own schemes and by their own devices. It will not happen. No amount of money, no amount of education, no amount of scheming by man will bring about the promise of God. It must come by faith. And not faith in something that seems plausible, but faith in a crucified Savior, a crucified Messiah, a bloody cross. Sometimes if you don't interact with unbelievers a lot, you forget how foolish this message sounds. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to do a memorial service for someone. And while I was there, I was sharing the gospel in the memorial service, and there were obviously a good number of unbelievers present. And this happens more often than not. There'll be somebody in the crowd who, when the gospel is preached, will have a visible reaction. And this was the case. Rolling eyes, sighing, turning to the other people like, mocking, literally, in the midst of a memorial service. And as you're standing there preaching the gospel, you realize what I'm saying makes no sense. It is foolishness to the perishing. Absolute foolishness. But it is the means by which God has chosen to save the world. And if you will come, you must come in humility. You cannot trust in yourself. Adam and Eve were wise in their own eyes. Right? Remember what it says? Eve saw that the food was desired for food and to make one wise. So she ate. But where did her wisdom get her? Where did Adam's wisdom get him? It led to their destruction. Abraham, on the other hand, believed God, trusted in him. And you remember what it says? And God counted it to him as righteousness. Friends, one day the Lord will return to judge the world in righteousness. And the question on that day that each of us must answer, and really not answer, but it's the question that each of us will find out the answer to, is this: is what I am trusting in, is who I am trusting in, trustworthy? And as tragic as the implosion of a submersible and the horror that must have taken place in that split second when that ship beneath the surface of the ocean imploded, as tragic as that is, it is nothing compared to the tragedy of finding out on the day of judgment when you stand before God that you were putting your trust in the wrong thing. As Lewis says, that is not the time for choosing. That is the time for discovering which side you have chosen. It does you no good on that day to say that you will bow down when you cannot stand up. Where is your trust? Where are you putting your trust? Friend, I would encourage you this morning, make sure that your trust is not misplaced. Learn as Abraham learned that Yahweh, the God of the covenant, the creator of heaven and earth, the one who made you, the one who loves you, that his promises are trustworthy. And that you can believe them, you can trust in them, even when they don't make sense, even when they seem to be foolishness to the world around you. He is faithful, and he will keep his promise. Let's pray.